Hello, my name is Tomáš Křížek. I work as a software developer at CZ.NIC. I'm one of the maintainers of DNS Resolver, and today I'd like to talk about deploying DNS-over-TLS or DNS-over-HTTPS on a resolver. First, let's look into the motivation of why would you want to provide a DoT or DOH service to your clients. If you use these protocols, then the data is basically encrypted in transit, so nobody on the network can really snoop into the contents of the DNS queries and replies that are being exchanged. Next, you might want to do this to prevent some of the attacks that would be possible on plain UDP DNS. Although if you really want to assure authenticity of the data, then you should really deploy DNSSEC either on the domain, on the authoritatives, but as a resolver operator, the best you can do is just turn DNSSEC validation on. Finally, the main reason you probably want to provide the DoT and DOH service is because of your clients that wish to use that. Some of the main clients for DoT are actually Android devices because they do opportunistic DNS-over-TLS, and also some forwarding resolvers can be configured to use this protocol. When it comes to DOH, the main clients are really the browsers that support it in their interface. So I'd like to do a brief comparison of these two protocols. What they do have in common is they are built on top of the TCP and TLS layer. The important bit that does the encryption is the TLS layer, and that is present in both. However, where they differ is what happens inside the encryption layer. And for DNS-over-TLS, there's just a very simple format that has been with us since the inception of DNS, and it contains no extra unnecessary data. It's very minimalistic. With DNS-over-HTTPS, however, you need to put the entire HTTP protocol inside the encrypted layer. And HTTP protocol isn't actually one thing. There are multiple versions that have almost nothing in common. And I just want to stress that for DNS over HTTPS, you certainly want to use HTTP 2, since the older protocols have their own issues that also affect like the speed of the resolution. But then even if you use HTTP 2, then you get either the GET method or the POST method. It's just really complicated. But once you actually establish that, then you also need to actually exchange the DNS messages somehow. So then you have a new format that is on top of the HTTP protocol itself, and then you finally have DNS over HTTPS. So all of this probably seems very complex, and it's because it is. To illustrate that, I have an image that compares what happens inside the encryption layer, and the colored boxes is actually the content, the DNS query and the reply. There are actually two pairs of those. And inside DNS over TLS, there is no extra metadata, no anything. It's just the 2-byte length. And inside DNS over HTTPS, and let's assume we use HTTP2 with the GET method and not any of the others, there's a lot of extra chatter and complexity that is going on. The problem with this is that it introduces additional attack surface. It has some extra, the metadata that can be used for fingerprinting or identifying the clients, such as the headers. But if you want to know more about this, then I go into some more details in my blog post. So let's say you decide to deploy DoT and or DOH. So what are your options? Well, first you can use a proxy such as DNS dist or DNS proxy or some other. I'm sure there are others. Or you can go for a built-in support that comes with the resolver. As of February 2021, both NOT resolver and Unbound have native support, and as far as I'm aware, the Bind 9 has finished their development of it, and it's probably going to be released soon, but I don't know the details of that. So let's compare these two options. Let's say you want to use a proxy. Well, the good thing is that you can use it with any resolver implementation, older versions that don't necessarily have a built-in support. And you can also offload the overhead of TCP and TLS. And this is really establishing a TCP connection, and the TLS handshake is really where most of the performance overhead comes from. So this can be a useful thing. On the other hand, using a proxy can be quite complex because it introduces a separate component. That means you have a separate different configuration file, you have another service that you need to care about and monitor, and there's just a lot of things, a lot of moving parts that can potentially go wrong if you use multiple components. Another thing that can be an issue is that the resolver loses the information about the IP of the client. This can be a problem if you do some filtering based on the source IP address. And finally, I think the performance probably isn't as good as the built-in support. Specifically, I've benchmarked DNS dist against Unbound and NOT resolver, and the performance is just nowhere near as good. But it depends on the implementation, and this might not apply universally. So always make sure to benchmark and test whatever it is that you choose to deploy. So the other option is to use a resolver that has a built-in support of DoT or DOH. The good thing about it is that the configuration is typically really simple. It's just 2 lines in a configuration file. As I've talked about before, this seems to be able to achieve a much greater performance, but also it seems to be more reliable and stable than some of the other solutions. The downside is that it requires a support in resolver, and these have been fairly recent additions. So for NOT resolver, you need to have a version 5.2 or newer, and the recently released Unbound also had this support. So once you deploy the service, what are the utilities and tools that you can use to do some checks, benchmark testing? One of these is kdig. It is very similar to the dig tool. It comes with not DNS, and it can be very useful for some basic sanity checks. You can just do a single query over the selected protocol, whether it's DoT or DOH for both post and get method. You fire off a single query, and you basically see the results. This can be very useful for some basic sanity checks. Another utility that can be used for more functional and performance testing is Flamethrower. I haven't used it much, but it looks very promising. It has an interface that is similar to DNSPerf. And the great thing about it is it can generate the query traffic and then basically send it to your resolvers over the connections that you configure there. This is somewhere in between a full realistic benchmark with your own data and a simple check. It's like it's a good performance testing tool, but it does not necessarily represent the clients realistically. If you want to do really realistic benchmark for DoT or DOH, I would recommend DNS Shotgun. It's a tool that we've written specifically for this purpose. What you can do is it can simulate hundreds of thousands of clients. The drawbacks of some of the other tools are that they establish a certain number of connections and then send the queries over them, which isn't really how your real clients are going to behave. Because first of all, your real clients will have a lot of connections. Each one of them will have at least one. And they will, open the connections, close them, etc. So the number of connections are also going to evolve over time. And a lot of the overhead when it comes to these services comes from handling these connections. So being able to simulate them realistically is quite important to have a realistic benchmark. So what this tool can do is that basically you capture your traffic, or the traffic of your clients, and then you can replay that, but over different protocols. So you can choose to replay it over DOH or DOT, and you can even choose to replay it over multiple protocols at the same time and get the result separately. So you can, for example, say, what would happen if 10% of my clients started using DOT, 10% started using DOH, and the 80% would keep using UDP. And you can actually replay this scenario and then see what would happen, how would the latency for the clients look like, what would be the load on your servers, etc. DNS Shotgun also comes with a very comprehensive benchmark documentation, so it has a lot of information, and I recommend you check it out. So based on our experience with these benchmarks, what is it that we can recommend? I definitely recommend using ECC or elliptic curve based certificates, because if you are going to use the RSA cryptography, you can expect a much larger overhead, and I just wouldn't recommend that. It's very important that you benchmark with your own traffic, with your own clients, to get an idea if your service can actually handle the load and if you're actually able to provide a reliable and stable service. When it comes to overhead of DNS-over-TLS and DNS-over-HTTPS, what we found out is I initially expected that the DNS-over-HTTPS will have a larger overhead, and it does, but it is not significant. The significant overhead really comes from establishing TCP connections and adding TLS encryption. So both of these protocols have comparable performance. When you compare this, however, to UDP, plain DNS, then you can expect about 3 times the performance overhead. And a former colleague of mine goes into the details of some of our results from benchmarks in his DNS-org talk. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend that you watch this talk. Finally, if you want to provide a really resilient service, you probably want to use multiple different implementations of the resolver. Because let's say there's a 0-day exploit or some vulnerability that hasn't been patched yet, and if you rely on a single implementation, that's a real challenge for your infrastructure. If you use multiple implementations, for example using Anycast, then you have, if you diversify your infrastructure in such a way, it's just going to be more resilient. So to sum it up, if you're going to deploy DoT or DOH, decide which one, and you're probably going to deploy both, since the clients, there are different kind of population of clients, right? The mobile devices, they want to use DoT, the browsers, they want to use DOH. So there's really no reason, if you're going to deploy DNS over HTTPS, you probably have no reason not to deploy also DNS over TLS. Then you also have to decide, do you want built-in support in the resolver, or are you going to use a proxy as a separate component? My personal recommendation, based on the benchmarks that I've done, would be to go for the built-in support if your infrastructure allows it, if you are able to use a sufficiently new version of the resolver. And finally, the most important recommendation is to really test and benchmark your own setups. A year or two ago, the tools just weren't there, but the situation nowadays is different. These tools are available, and you should really take advantage of that, because you can discover some issues before you put your service to production, and you can also use the tools to plan your infrastructure properly. So if you're interested more in Node Resolver, you can check out our website. We also offer both free and paid support. If you're interested in DNS Shotgun or have any comments or questions, you can use the issue tracker or reach out to me directly. That is all. Thank you for your attention.